How awkward of me. Oh, what a stupid thing to do. Oh, I'm so sorry. Please don't bother. It doesn't really matter.
Oh, leave that. Go and lay another place at my table. Mademoiselle will have lunch with me.
Oh, but I couldn't possibly.
Why not?
Oh, well, please don't be polite. It's very kind of you, but I'll be all right if they just change the cloth.
I wasn't being polite. I should have asked you to have lunch with me, even if we hadn't upset the vase so clumsily. Come along.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Dr. Eric Mays, who is the CEO of Endomag. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks very much, Scott. Thanks for having me.
Now, before your current startup, you led a commercial development at Cambridge Display Technology, which was sold for $285 million. And prior to CDT, you were the CEO of Nanomagnetics, which developed high-performance materials for data storage. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience and how those positions prepare you for your current role today?
Certainly. So my background, I'm a material scientist, but then got into startups with the first company, Nanomagnetics, back in, I guess it was 1998. As you mentioned, it was looking at data storage specifically, looking at addressing a problem that the hard disk data storage industry was facing, technically is still facing. And looking at ways to increase the amount of information you could store per square inch on a disk of hard disk media. And the industry at the time had some technical challenges in terms of being able to continue pushing that doubling of capacity every year. And Nanomagnetics was set up to address that at the material science level. So that's basically how I made a transition from being an academic technologist into looking at basically trying to innovate in a new space, identifying a customer problem, and developing technology to address it. We can come back to some of the challenges that introduced me to. But one of the primary ones that it and also Cambridge Display Technology showed was the challenge of introducing a completely new technology into an established industry. Data storage in the case of Nanomagnetics, display technology in the case of Cambridge Display Technology, which was developing organic polymers that when you apply a current to them, they glow in different colors, and ultimately you could have red, green, and blue versions of those polymers that you could create pixels to put into a television or a screen, similar to all the OLED screens that are available in today's cell phones and upcoming laptops, etc. But taking those new material developments into existing well-established supply chains, particularly if they had slightly different ways to go about manufacturing. Inkjet printing, actually, in the case of both, meant complete change to the workflow for factories, and it meant that commercialization was a challenge for both companies. So I think what both those prepare me for is really understanding the customer requirements, not just from a performance of materials, performance of the technology point of view, but also how they integrate with their existing supply chains, how they exist alongside existing manufacturing processes, etc. And when I joined Endomag, I took that learning with me and focused really on the customers and trying to fit in with current clinical practice and not changing anything really about the familiarity with the processes they have, but changing the technology underneath it in a transparent way, so it behaved the same way they expected, but all of the technicalities were hidden from them.
Yeah, a couple of very interesting points. One is this, Moore's law as it pertains to the storage on these disks. This was, of course, top of mind during the 90s, and of course in 2000. We've progressed significantly. I'm sure you know that. And then the other component that you're referring to is this notion that sometimes I think we think in terms of great solutions, but then we don't really think about the implications of change behavior that's required to adopt those solutions. And I think what you're really articulating is a need to fit in with their business processes and their habits to a great extent, and allowing for kind of a seamless experience so that it's not disrupting the workflow that they're accustomed to or the processes that they're accustomed to, but rather swapping out some of the the underlying technologies that may be invisible to them, but it really enhances the analytics and some of the capabilities. Now, specifically, we're going to switch gears to talk about the application within detecting breast cancer. So can you first give us a baseline of what is the current approach to detection and diagnostics, and what are some of the major issues with that current approach?
Okay. It's actually a bit broader than just the products that we have. So, the current standard for breast cancer is that people go in for a routine mammogram, which is, an X-ray that they pass through the breast, do it periodically, look for changes in density. Some patients may have more dense breasts than others, and so they may use an additional imaging technique to catch suspicious lesions before they grow. And what's happening in that area is there aren't as many radiologists entering the field as there had been in the past. And so workflow is held back due to capacity. And so this is why you see a lot of interest in artificial intelligence coming in to make the radiologist's job easier and support the fact that there are less radiologists coming in. Where Endomag gets involved is that next stage. If it turns out that there's something suspicious, they've done a biopsy, it turns out that it is cancer. Quite often you'd also have genetic or genomic typing of that cancer to understand maybe whether you might do a drug treatment to decrease the cancer's volume, the tumor's volume before surgery. So there's a bit of genetics that goes alongside that, alongside oncologic drugs. But unless those knock the cancer completely back, the next step is surgery. And so that's where we come in. And either because chemotherapy has shrunk the size of that tumor, or because they've done screening frequently enough to be able to pick up cancer when it's very small, that means that the radiologist can see the tumor, but when the surgeon goes in to find it and take it out with a healthy bit of margin around that tumor to ensure that they've cut all the cancerous cells, it's a challenge for them to actually find that when they're doing the surgery. And so there's a communication that needs to happen between radiology and the surgeon. And you'd think that, well, the radiologist can make a picture. Surely they can just hand that over to the surgeon. They go, okay, X marks the spot. But working in 3 dimensions, being able to really describe where that tumor is, particularly when the patient is prone and their breasts compress, means that there needs to be more than just a photograph. And so the current standard is to implant a wire that has a tiny hook on the end. They do that, the radiologist does that on the day of the surgery. They plant that wire down to the center of the tumor, and that wire then protrudes from the breast. Patient goes off to surgery, the surgeon follows that wire, cutting as they go until they get towards the end, and then they'll take out a ball of tissue at the end of that. And it sounds pretty crude, and it is. And the big challenge is that between the time that wire is implanted and when the surgery happens is that wire can move. And that surgeon is effectively flying blind in that case. And so this is where one of our products, Magsy, comes in, that we can implant that at the site of the tumor. It doesn't move. And then rather than having the surgeon follow a wire down, we provide them with something that looks like a wand metal detector that gives them direction and distance away from the seed so they can take out that primary tumor at a healthy margin. So that's one thing that we get involved in. But a secondary question that the physicians have is, okay, we've got that tumor, but has that tumor spread to the rest of the body? Particularly if it's early stage, it's difficult to know. And so what they will look to do is find the lymph nodes that would be first to drain from that tumor. in the past being pre-2010, they would take out all the lymph nodes in the armpit region, analyze all of those. It had the downside of being quite an invasive surgery. It's a dissection, you risk nerve damage. But once you take out all of those lymph nodes, then lymph can no longer drain from the arm, and the arm can swell up in a painful condition called lymphedema. And so in 2010, the standard of care became something called a sentinel lymph node biopsy. And the concept was, well, if cancer is going to spread from a primary tumor to those lymph nodes, surely it'll go to one or two of those lymph nodes first. So if we can find those sentinel nodes, maybe they will tell us something about whether the cancer is spread. And what got shown in 2010 is a couple of big randomized control trials showed that finding those one or two nodes that you'd spread to first had the same predictive value as taking out all the lymph nodes, which meant they could spare patients of that really invasive dissection and all of those comorbidities with that. And the way they went about finding those sentinel nodes was to inject a radioisotope. And a radioisotope called technetium-99 has a 6-hour half-life. And then again, it limits that interaction between nuclear medicine and surgeons in that because it has such a short half-life, you have to do the injection basically right before surgery or, pretty closely timed. Otherwise, that signal in those nodes that you're hunting for with a Geiger counter will disappear. So what Endomag did in our first product is something called MagTrace, is to replace that radioisotope with a magnetic material that we call MagTrace. It is a series of magnetic nanoparticles that get injected and flow to those lymph nodes. And we use that same detector that we use to find MagSeed to find those nodes. But doing that sort of solves a number of problems. One is it gets rid of nuclear medicine. It means that you don't need to be at a hospital site that has nuclear medicine. You don't need to be flying patients around that are radioactive. But it also decouples the time period between when either the radiologist or normally a nuclear medicine person might do their injections and when the surgery can happen. And that turned out to be really material during the COVID crisis because we could decouple those processes between groups. We could basically mark patients, allow them to go home and quarantine, and then come back for surgeries, which really helped with workflow, and also allowed for patients to be outside of the main hospitals and in smaller clinics to help with the backlog of patients.
So Eric, as I'm listening, I mean, it's just mind-boggling to me, just how crude these techniques have been. I mean, first of all, I mean, the fact that we're dealing with radiology, assets that are two-dimensional, and yet you're dealing with three-dimensional material, and the fact that it gets compressed and it's not exact, it moves, it's not precise. And this notion of essentially these wires all over that are jutting out, and then you're supposed to follow the line to remove those different cells and whatnot. And then, of course, you're right about the short time span in terms of the radioactive use, as well as just the cumbersomeness, I think. So really, I think a lot of the IP that you're referring to originally started from the endomagnetics that came out of the research from the University of College of London and University of Houston.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more in terms of the use of these magnetics to remove the need for exactly what you're talking about, this radioactivity when staging breast cancer. And more specifically, if you could get into just a little breakdown about the various products that you mentioned, which are the Sentinel localization system, the MagSeed markers, and the MagTrace lymphatic tracers. If you just go into a little bit more detail and how each of these provide the significant improvements to what was fairly crude in the past. You may also like our quarterly Ask Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit asterperkins.com/events.
Okay. So, where Endomag started is actually an interaction between two academics, one at University College London and one at the University of Houston. The one in London had some expertise in using magnetic particles in healthcare. And you might say, well, have magnetic particles been used in healthcare, and one of the big areas has been in MRI to generate contrast. You could inject these small particles that go through the bloodstream and would then localize in certain tissues, primarily the liver and spleen, and they'd be where the blood pool was. And there might be areas where a tumor, if it was in those regions, wouldn't show up. And so it creates a contrast. And so these contrast agents for MRI have been around for a number of years. Magnetics has sort of been replaced by other materials, things such as gadolinium have become a bit more prevalent because they're generally more usable in terms of they're smaller and so they can go throughout the body, whereas magnetics tended to be a bit chunkier and just went to the liver and spleen. So the London academic had that expertise, and the University of Houston had a lot of expertise in superconductivity. There was a time when superconductors was the next big thing, long before buckyballs or graphene. And there's a lot of expertise in Houston, and the University of Houston was looking at applying superconductivity to magnetic sensing. And so they had a sensor that they wanted to develop, and the group in London had some particles they wanted to use. And initially they thought, well, let's put these two together to make an in vitro diagnostic, something that has much more sensitivity than some other things that are in the field. And what was, I think, unusual for them as academics is they actually went and spoke to the market. And when they started speaking to people, they found out that people were saying, well, actually, we don't require any more sensitivity for this particular diagnostic test. But, maybe you should go talk to these breast surgeons that have this new technique that's, brewing that relies on nuclear medicine. And so they went and spoke to some breast surgeons who said, yeah, we've got this new technique, but we can't do it everywhere. We can do it in the main medical center, but we can't do it in smaller clinics. And that's particularly important for rural areas where you have underserved patient populations. And so they decided that would be what they'd focus on. So the first product they focused on was something called the Sentinel, which is the instrument. It's the metal detector sort of equivalent or concept of the system. And it's quite intuitive when you look at it, in that you've got a probe that's held by the surgeon in their hand, and they basically wave it over the patient. And when they are in the direction of something that's magnetic, they'll get an audio pitch up, and they'll get a notification on the screen in terms of numbers. And then as you go in towards where you saw that peak, it'll increase, and it basically guides you to something. What's not obvious is that it's doing a pretty amazing thing, is that it's detecting a millionth of the Earth's magnetic field. So it's not only detecting magnetism, but it's actually generating an oscillating magnetic field that magnetizes things in its path, and it picks out this 1 part per million signal to say this is where you need to go. And there were lots of signal processing challenges that many technologists would be familiar with, but there are also lots of engineering challenges regarding materials. So we would make coils that if you're familiar with the old electromagnets that you might play with as a kid, connect them to a battery and with a nail through it, and they pick something up. Same sort of concept, but these, if the dimensions changed within a few nanometers, it would throw off the ability to detect things. So we had to look at what these coils were on, what materials, certain ceramics, and then solve some big technical challenges to make this instrument that was simple and intuitive, but all of the challenging physics was sort of made completely opaque to the user. And the concept was that they would use that system and the same materials that people were using for MRI contrast enhancement to find these lymph nodes that would be implicated in the spread of cancer. And that's about the same time I joined the company as really the first employee. And if you're familiar with general business models, people will always look for the printer ink model, the razor blade rather than the razor, and try to have as many consumables as possible. And this was, as a business model, just an instrument without any consumable. That was someone else's business. And so from a business perspective, it's important to find a way to acquire that consumable. But it turned out that not only would he not acquire it, but everyone that was making these suddenly got out of the market. And so the year I joined the company, I left my nice safe position working for Sumitomo Chemical. I joined a startup that had just developed this new piece of equipment that there was nothing to use it with. So we had to develop our own and find a route through doing that, as well as solve all the regulatory challenges, because all of those contrast agents for MRI imaging were regulated as drugs. And so we had to go out and basically find something that normally would be regulated as a drug, which would take many years, many clinical trials, many millions of dollars to get to market. And we were able to argue that our material be used as a medical device because of this gray area that exists really at that borderline of what is a nanomaterial and is it behaving as a drug or is it a device, and teasing out that definition. So that was one of our big first hurdles, is getting that material mag trace approved as a device, which let us get it approved and get into the market much quicker than had it been a drug. That potentially would have stopped the company dead in its tracks.
Well, I think you really highlight many of the kind of challenges that are kind of inherent to medical devices. But again, because we're dealing with essentially at the nanometer level, the precision accuracy is incredibly important. And to your point, there's a lot of factors that needs to be taken into consideration. I mean, I think the core IP is one thing, but to put in a form factor that's usable, that's intuitive, and then accounting for all these signal, noise and signal aspects that you're referring to. And then trying to get precision around that. I mean, all of these things are hitting everything from the material science, the engineering, the actual mechanical portions, and then the user experience. I mean, and then of course you even mentioned the regulatory side as well. And I think you're very fortunate that that you guys were able to make that argument to find that kind of gray area that otherwise would have brought you into more of a therapeutic or drug FDA oversight. So. I think one of the questions I would have for you is, starting a startup is difficult enough, but in the case of a more medical tech-oriented types of startup like yours, how have you been able to navigate some of these more challenging nuances to create this full system in such a way that you could actually make progress and make progress quickly? And I think about your past experience with storing memory on electromagnetic disk as an example. That has a ton of similarities in terms of not just the end component or the disk that you're making, but the entire infrastructure that's needed to actually run these types of processes. Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
I think that's part of the answer to that question, is that I start to value experience more. I think when I was younger, I was like, I can do this. I see the way to the market and it's going to be easy. But, having had years of trying to solve these problems and do in, as you highlighted, a very multidisciplinary space, and there's no way I could cover all of those areas, but, be able to at least recognize certain strengths, recognize areas of weakness, and then build a team around me that can help tackle all of the multitude of challenges. So rather than just being focused on, we got to solve this one technology problem and it fits in here, but solve the broader, we need to solve manufacturing, we need to solve quality, we need to solve regulatory, we need to solve marketing, customer engagement, that feedback loop. It took a number of years, at least for me, to understand the value of doing all of that and to learn how to do it and how not to do it. And so all of those experiences prepared me in a way that when I was approached to be the CEO of Endomag, I was really excited. I understood that I'd go from a nice, relatively stable job with a multinational chemical company to being the sole employee in a company that I didn't know a lot about. I mean, I knew about breast cancer, sort of. I didn't know anything about the regulatory space. I didn't know much about the clinical environment and the nature of surgeons as customers. And had I known about those things, I might not have done it. So in truth, and this may be kind of a silly answer, but I think there's a bit of value in ignorance, as long as you've got the capability for asking good questions and being analytical about it and recognizing your own weaknesses and finding people that can help fill those out. And that question about, is it a device or is it a drug, came out of my ignorance when I really looked at it. And a lot of people had said, oh, it's obviously a drug, you're injecting it into the body. And I thought, okay, that seems reasonable. But because I didn't understand it, I had to read, what is the definition of a drug? What is the definition of a device? And that highlighted that opportunity to take it in one direction rather than the other. And I still think there's very much a value in not being the smartest person in the room, but asking lots of questions. And as someone who did their PhD and was trained to want to be the smartest person in the room, it was a big challenge to shift, I guess, how I viewed using my skills, and to change from wanting to be the person who has the answer to be the person that asks the right question.
I agree. I think as a leader, I absolutely agree with you. It's not about having all the right answers, but it's being able to pinpoint. And I love the example of looking and examining the FDA definition as well as precedents, and being able to do that level of investigation, that the level of forensics really that got you to the decision point that it was. I want to go back to results in terms of there's a lot of years of effort and capital that's gone into this. Talk about some successes and case studies, and specifically in the context of the pandemic and how prior processes or procedures have to be done in large hospitals. And now you mentioned things can be done in a rural setting, things can be done, segmented, where people can go home, rest, and have a period before they come back for surgery in a smaller clinic. So if you could talk about some of those wins, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I gave a bit of detail about the Sentinel and its technical challenges, and then talked about MagTrace and its regulatory challenges. The most recent product that we brought out, and indeed our most successful, is something called MagSeed, and that's the one that gets implanted at the site of the tumor and replaces the wires. And where that came from was just having had product one in the market and interacting with our customers. They would come back and say, hey, we like this product, but really what we could really solve is, did you know we're still putting wires in patients? This has been around since the 1970s. There's got to be something better than this. Can't you just make a magnet to stick in the patient and at that side of the tumor and help us find that? And so that, that was an innovation brought to us on a plate by our customers. And that was also another big lesson for me. I think it was the final straw to realize it's not about trying to find the right technology and then pushing that out to customers. It's about really understanding what the customers need and then getting all the technology right to address that problem. But then in the current context with COVID over the last year, basically a lot of the hospitals, their ICUs were filling up, and the rest of the hospital will be given over to COVID patients. And so I think it was like in the UK, I think it's 4.5 million patients are waiting in line for surgeries at the moment. Now, some of those are not, absolutely critical. And I think even prior to COVID, maybe the total was 3 million, but still it's, a large queue of people waiting to have surgeries. And for something as important as breast cancer that you want to deal with quickly before it grows any further, it was an imperative for breast surgeons to find a way to manage these patients. And if they didn't have any room in the hospitals, their question was, well, how do we tackle this? And so they started looking towards like private clinics, as well as sort of what they called cold sites. So small areas that they could manage infection control and stuff off-site of the main hospital. But their challenge in using these sites is they didn't have access to nuclear medicine. And also, they didn't necessarily have good timing to interact with the radiologist. So putting in a wire, if you need to bring that patient in later that day or the next morning, that means you've got an infection risk and a flow of patients there. And so this is where we found our customers again saying, hey, this is great. We can use MagTrace off-site. It doesn't matter. sort of when we inject them. They can do that 30 days in advance in the patient home. They can put in the mag seed in advance of surgery. So they can do both of those injections or insertions, send the patient home, have them quarantine, come back 2 weeks later and just show up for surgery, not have to visit anywhere else. And they can, basically the surgeon just sees patient after patient and doesn't have to wait for any odd efficiencies coming out of the radiology department, and they don't have to worry about a queue of potentially infected or infecting patients. So that really helped balance out the workload, the caseload here in the UK. We took that learning into the US, and some of that has also been happening in the US. It's slightly different system because also states were doing different things with COVID at different times, and patients can move from state to state. Some can. So that seemed to be less of an issue in the US than it did in the UK. But that was one of the areas that the value of our products came in. But there's another one, which is, I alluded to it about accessibility to maybe rural centers that don't have access to nuclear medicine. But on a global basis, there are a lot of hospitals that didn't even have access in their main hospital to nuclear medicine and couldn't even do these procedures. And so what they'd be doing outside of, they wouldn't even do an axial lymph node dissection to take all those lymph nodes out. They would simply do a mastectomy. And there are, certain areas where that is, really life-changing for someone. And to be able to bring in the ability to do breast-conserving surgery in sites that haven't been able to do that was huge. And so we saw this in South Africa. We've seen this in Namibia. So now we talk about wins. Wins for me is the fact that we've got, over 43 countries now using MagTrace and MagSeed. We've treated over 130,000 women on a global basis. And so what started as, us marking cases on a whiteboard one by one for those early first 50, now we're at, 140,000 and north of that in a number of territories and countries that simply wouldn't have had access to the best standard of care before, and we've been able to provide that.
Well, I am so honored and just incredibly impressed with the hard work of your team and of course yourself at the helm team, but really more importantly asking the right questions and being a student and especially asking the clients and the physicians and the actual users how they're using it and what other use cases would they like to see. So it's just amazing and the impact that you guys are having. So with that, I've been joined by Dr. Eric Mays, who is the CEO of Endomag. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks very much, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.